Just days ago in Beijing, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping stood shoulder to shoulder at the Great Hall of the People, projecting a unified front and proclaiming their alliance had reached an unprecedented high. But behind the red carpets and choreographed handshakes lies a dark reality for the Kremlin. Right now, a massive sovereign territory the size of Australia is quietly slipping from Moscow's grasp, not due to an invasion, but because of an internal demographic collapse so severe that the Russian president has branded it a threat to national security. Russia spans 11 time zones and over 6.6 million square miles of land. Yet its crown jewel, the Far Eastern Federal District, which makes up 40% of the country's territory, is being hollowed out. Over the last 35 years, this frontier has bled 25% of its population, dropping to an estimated 7.8 million people. That means this entire strategic expanse, 70% larger than the United States, now holds fewer people than a single major Chinese metropolis. In remote subregions, the numbers are apocalyptic, with the Chukotka Peninsula losing 68% of its residents, and Magadan Oblast shedding over 63% since the Soviet collapse. The immediate catalyst for this accelerating emergency is the war in Ukraine, which has consumed the Kremlin's budget and manpower. To sustain its bloody campaign thousands of miles to the west, Moscow has systematically cannibalized its own eastern frontier. Working-age men have been disproportionately mobilized, sent to the front lines, killed, or forced to flee, leaving a catastrophic labor vacuum in a region that already could not find enough workers. Desperate to keep its resource extraction industries alive, Russia has turned to an unorthodox and volatile remedy. Unofficial estimates reveal that over 50,000 North Korean state-sponsored laborers have been brought into the Far East, working brutal 18-hour shifts under conditions resembling modern slavery, with their wages funneled directly to Pyongyang. Simultaneously, China is aggressively moving into the vacuum, leveraging Moscow's isolation from Western markets. Chinese investment in the region is approaching $13.5 billion, while cross-border trade volumes have surged by over 36% in just 6 months. An estimated 500,000 Chinese citizens now live between Vladivostok and the Ural Mountains, effectively absorbing the local economy and building enclaves where ethnic Russians are practically absent from the workforce. This economic colonization is deeply alarming because of the heavy historical friction between the two nuclear-armed giants. Before 1860, this entire territory, historically known as Outer Manchuria, belonged to Qing Dynasty China. Beijing has never forgotten this imperial land grab, recently mandating that official maps list Russian cities by their original Chinese names. As ethnic Russians continue their mass exodus toward the west, leaving behind the world's largest untapped reserves of timber, rare earth elements, gold, and diamonds, the regional balance of power is permanently shifting. Moscow is paying for its current survival by trading away its territorial sovereignty, entrenching two heavily armed neighbors on its own soil. If the Kremlin can no longer staff or govern its most valuable frontier, what happens when this economic dependency turns into absolute physical control? To understand how this quiet conquest is unfolding, we must examine the tactical realities shifting across the border. What specific demographic maneuvers could permanently redraw the map of Asia without a single shot being fired? The demographic maneuvers unfolding along the border are already setting the stage for a geopolitical masterpiece. A creeping annexation that relies on proximity and asymmetry rather than traditional columns of armor. To visualize how a potential hot conflict would actually play out across this unforgiving landscape, we have to look at the map through the eyes of military planners in Beijing and Moscow. The border between Russia and China stretches for over 2,600 miles, dominated by the massive Amur and Ushuri river systems. In a theoretical showdown, the opening phase would not look like a massive, noisy invasion, but rather a swift, gray zone stabilization operation triggered by a sudden breakdown of law and order in the isolated Russian border towns. Within the first 24 hours, the primary tactical objective would be the immediate seizure or neutralization of the key bridges crossing the Amur River, such as the major links at Blagoveshchensk and Tongjiang. By securing these narrow choke points, An advancing force secures its supply lines before the vast and brutal terrain can swallow them whole. From there, the geographical nightmare for the Russian defenders intensifies. The entire Russian Far East is tethered to the rest of the Federation by a single, fragile logistical spine, the Trans-Siberian Railway. In many places, this vital rail network runs a mere 15 to 30 miles from the Chinese border, making it incredibly vulnerable to localized cross-border strikes or special operation sabotage. If the Trans-Siberian Railway is cut, Vladivostok, located over 5,600 miles away from the decision-makers in Moscow, becomes a literal island, completely severed from overland reinforcement. A day-by-day progression of this scenario would see advanced columns pushing north from the border, attempting to exploit the 470-mile corridor between Vladivostok and Khabarovsk. But this is where the geography itself becomes an active combatant. The terrain here is an unforgiving maze of dense taiga forests, jagged mountain ranges like the Sikhote Alin, and vast tracts of swampy permafrost. The weather dictates every single military movement in this part of the world. During the brutal Siberian winters, temperatures regularly plummet to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, a level of cold that freezes engine blocks, snaps metal cables, and drains batteries in minutes. Infantry operations become a battle for survival against frostbite rather than the enemy. Conversely, the arrival of spring brings the dreaded Rasputitsa, the mud season, when the top layer of permafrost thaws into a thick, soup-like morass. Heavy tracked vehicles and multi-ton supply trucks find themselves hopelessly bogged down in mud fields that stretch for hundreds of miles, choking off the momentum of any advance and turning roads into shooting galleries. Therefore, any successful tactical maneuver would rely on a lightning-fast window between the deep freeze of late winter and the absolute mud of early spring. If an offensive pushing north reaches past the initial river cities, it encounters the formidable barrier of the Stanovoy Mountains, a rugged, wall-like range rising over 7,000 feet. The passes through these mountains are narrow and easily defended, requiring highly specialized mountain warfare units to clear the heights. For Russia, attempting to move defensive reinforcements across these vast distances is a logistical impossibility. A mechanized brigade trying to relocate from central Siberia to the Pacific coast would have to travel over 2,000 miles across poorly maintained roads or rely on air transport that is increasingly grounded due to maintenance failures. Every mile an army moves deeper into the Far East, the wilderness itself pushes back, diluting troop density and stretching supply lines to the breaking point. Yet, as military history has proven time and again, even the most brilliant tactical maneuvers, the most precise understanding of terrain, and the perfect exploitation of weather windows mean absolutely nothing without the actual machines of war capable of enforcing that will on the battlefield. The machines of war assigned to hold this vast eastern frontier reveal a striking disconnect between theoretical supremacy and the brutal reality of the battlefield. On paper, Russia protects its Pacific flank with some of the most advanced hardware in its inventory. Led by the Sukhoi Su-35S Flanker E air superiority fighter. This twin-engine Titan boasts a maximum speed of 1,500 miles per hour and an impressive combat range of 1,000 miles without external fuel tanks. It is equipped with the Urbis E passive electronically scanned array radar, engineered to detect airborne targets up to 250 miles away while carrying a weapons payload of 17,600 pounds across 12 external hardpoints. Yet, real-world combat data from the skies over Ukraine has exposed the fatal flaws of this design. The Su-35S lacks true low observable stealth, making it highly visible to modern integrated air defense networks. Because the Russian defense industry has struggled to produce sufficient quantities of precision-guided munitions, pilots are routinely forced to fly low-altitude bombing runs, placing these multi-million-dollar jets directly within the firing envelope of cheap, shoulder-fired missiles. On the ground, Russia relies on the T-90M Proryev main battle tank to anchor its territorial defense. Weighing over 100,000 pounds and powered by a 1,000-horsepower engine, the T-90M can reach speeds of 37 miles per hour. It features explosive reactive armor and a 125mm smoothbore gun. However, actual combat has proved that the tank inherits a catastrophic vulnerability that has plagued Russian armored doctrine for decades: a carousel-style automatic loader located directly beneath the crew. A single penetrative hit to the hull frequently triggers a sympathetic detonation of the stored propellant blocks, instantly blowing the turret completely off the vehicle and killing the crew. In the context of the Far East, this design flaw is compounded by a logistical nightmare. The heavy weight of the tank makes it entirely dependent on specialized heavy recovery vehicles, which are virtually non-existent in the remote taiga, meaning a simple mechanical failure or a bogging down in seasonal mud results in the total abandonment of the asset. Across the Amur River, China's Northern Theater Command stands ready with an entirely different class of military hardware, anchored by the Chengdu J-20 Mighty Dragon stealth fighter. The J-20 is designed to operate at speeds exceeding 1,300 miles per hour, with an operational combat radius of over 1,100 miles, utilizing an advanced, active, electronically scanned array radar that can track dozens of targets simultaneously at long range. To support its ground forces, Beijing deploys the Type 99A main battle tank, a 130,000-pound behemoth pushing a 1,500-horsepower diesel engine to a top speed of 50 miles per hour with a maximum cruising range of 370 miles. The Type 99A features a computerized main gun and a unique laser communication device intended to send line-of-sight encrypted data across the battlefield. But just like the Russian hardware, these Chinese systems possess critical vulnerabilities that on-paper statistics deliberately conceal. The primary weakness of China's advanced weaponry is its complete lack of high-intensity combat testing, leaving its complex digital architecture highly vulnerable to the extreme environmental conditions of the Siberian frontier. The intricate sensor arrays, unproven thermal imaging sights, and delicate electronic components of the J-20 and Type 99A are highly susceptible to systemic failure when exposed to the brutal sub-zero temperatures of the region. Furthermore, the massive weight of the Type 99A requires an immense, unbroken, logistical tail of fuel tankers and heavy transport trucks. In a landscape where the few available roads can be instantly vaporized by long-range artillery, these heavy armored divisions risk running out of fuel and spare parts within 48 hours of crossing the border, turning into static targets. The tyranny of distance ensures that the side with the most sophisticated missiles, or heaviest armor, cannot easily sustain an offensive when their primary manufacturing hubs are located thousands of miles away from the front lines. This reality forces a sobering realization upon modern strategic planners. While these incredible machines of war capture the public imagination, the ultimate outcome of the struggle for the Far East will not be decided by bullets and missiles alone, because the 21st century has introduced an entirely new paradigm of warfare that targets the economic and political stability of a nation from within. This economic and systemic warfare is where the true, irreversible damage is being done to Russia's hold over its vast eastern frontier. Decades of crippling economic sanctions have fundamentally severed the Kremlin from the global financial system, creating an invisible blockade that is slowly strangling the region's lifeblood. Without access to Western technology, specialized microchips, and precision industrial machinery, the infrastructure required to keep the Far East connected to Moscow is disintegrating. Consider the aviation sector, which is the only lifeline for hundreds of isolated communities scattered across thousands of miles of wilderness. Moscow's ambitious plan to build 1,000 domestic aircraft to achieve self-reliance collapsed completely, yielding just 13 planes before being abandoned. As commercial fleets degrade without spare parts, the tyranny of distance wins, effectively cutting the Far East adrift. At the same time, the local economy has been structurally inverted. By forcing a total pivot toward Beijing, the Kremlin has allowed China to establish an economic stranglehold, dictating the prices of Russia's vast reserves of oil, gas, and timber, while turning the Far Eastern Federal District into a captive market for Chinese manufactured goods. This economic subjugation is fueling massive, quiet resentment among the disgruntled citizens who call this harsh frontier home. For generations, the people of the Far East have felt neglected by the distant elite in Moscow, but the current conflict has pushed that frustration to a boiling point. Local populations watch as their sons are disproportionately funneled into the meat grinder of a distant war, while the tax revenues generated from their own natural resources are stripped away to fund the conflict rather than maintaining local schools, hospitals, and roads. The cost of living has skyrocketed, sitting up to 100% higher than the national average in remote areas like Chukotka, while real wages continue to stagnate. This disparity has triggered a dangerous psychological shift, giving rise to fringe but growing cultural conversations about an independent Siberia. When the local population begins to view the Kremlin not as a protective government but as an extractive colonial master, the social contract implodes. The vacuum left by fleeing ethnic Russians is being filled by 500,000 Chinese citizens and tens of thousands of state-sponsored North Korean laborers, fundamentally altering the demographic fabric of the territory. This brings us to the ultimate tragic paradox of Vladimir Putin's grand strategic gamble. The Kremlin launched its campaign in Ukraine under the banner of resisting Western encirclement and reasserting Russia's status as an unyielding superpower. Yet, in his desperate attempt to conquer territory to the west, he has functionally surrendered sovereignty over an area 70% larger than the United States to the east. Moscow is paying for its immediate survival by trading away its long-term future, transforming its most resource-rich frontier into a de facto economic colony of Beijing. No borders will change tomorrow, and no army will march across the Amur River next week. But the silent, steady transition from Russian demographic dominance to East Asian economic control is already a mathematical certainty. Russia is quite literally losing the Far East by failing to keep its own people there. It is a staggering shift in the global balance of power. And it leaves us with one critical question. Is the complete integration of the Russian Far East into China's sphere of influence an inevitability? Or can Moscow somehow reverse this multi-decade collapse before it is too late? We want to know what you think, so sound off in the comments below and let us know your take on this silent conquest. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden forces shaping our world, make sure to smash that like button, hit the subscribe button, and turn on the bell icon so you never miss another episode from Military Horizon. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next one.